Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
I very much want common sense immigration reform to pass. This bill is going to pass the Senate. But as written, this bill will not pass the House. As written, this bill will not pass into law. And if this bill did become law, it would not solve the problem. Indeed, it would make the problem of illegal immigration that we have today worse rather than better. If you likewise want to see common sense immigration reform pass, then you have reason to be both optimistic and pessimistic. You have reason for optimism because there is widespread bipartisan agreement on many, many aspects of immigration. Outside of Washington, D.C., there is widespread bipartisan agreement that, number one, our current immigration system is broken. It is not working. Number two, that we have to get serious about securing the borders, about doing everything we can to stop illegal immigration, that in a post-9/11 world, it doesn't make any sense that we don't know who's coming into this country, we don't know their history, we don't know their background. And number three, that we need to improve and streamline legal immigration, that we need to remain a nation that doesn't just welcome but that celebrates legal immigration. On those basic principles, there is widespread bipartisan agreement. And if this body were to focus on those areas of bipartisan agreement, that's how we would get an immigration bill passed into law, not just by one chamber of Congress, but actually passed into law. The reason, Mr. President, however, for pessimism is that to date, the conduct of the White House and the Senate Democrats who have been driving this process suggests that they are more interested in finding a partisan issue to campaign on in 2014 and 2016 than they are in actually passing a bill to fix our broken immigration system. Of all of the issues swirling about this bill, the path to citizenship for those who are here illegally is the single most divisive issue. And that is the issue on which the Obama White House and the Senate Democrats insist. And by insisting on that division, I believe they, by design, destine this bill to be voted down. I think if we don't end up fixing our immigration system, that would be a very unfortunate outcome. Now, I would note in the Judiciary Committee we spent considerable time considering amendments to this bill. And at the outset of the markup, I observed that I hoped it would be a real markup, that the majority had the votes if they wanted to reject every substantive amendment. But I very much hoped that they wouldn't, that they would be willing to work with the members of the committee to improve the bill to make it fix the problem. Sadly, at the end of the markup, I was forced to observe that it had played out exactly as I feared it might at the beginning. Namely, that the majority of Democrats on the committee voted down just about every single major substantive amendment that was presented, one after the other after the other. And what they repeatedly said was there had been a deal that was cut. A deal that was cut with the union bosses, with the interest groups, and that deal could not be changed. Well, if that's the case, Mr. President, that deal is not going to get passed into law. In my view, this legislation has two major problems. The first is it does not fix the problem. You know, in 1986, Congress passed major immigration reform, the last time we addressed and successfully passed immigration reform. And that bill had two major components. Number one, it granted amnesty, explicit, full-out amnesty for some 3 million people who were then here illegally. And the American people were told this amnesty will be in exchange for securing the borders. In 1986, Congress told the American people we're granting amnesty, but in exchange we will fix the problem so illegal immigration will go away as a problem. Once these 3 million get amnesty, there will be no more. Now, sadly, we're here some 30 years later, and instead of 3 million, there are roughly 11 million people here illegally. Because what happened in '96 is the amnesty happened, and the borders never got secured. If this bill were to pass into law, in 10, 20, 30 years, we'd be back here talking about another 10, 20, 30 million people here illegally because, like the 1986 bill, this bill will not fix the problem, and indeed it will exacerbate it. This bill is enormously complicated. Indeed, this bill, as currently written, is 1,076 pages. 1,076 pages. It is longer than the Dodd-Frank bill, which was 848 pages. It is roughly half the size of Obamacare, which was over 2,000 pages. In these 1,076 pages, there are right now over 1,000 waivers given to the Secretary of Homeland Security and other members of the executive branch to waive law enforcement provisions, to waive border security, to give to the executive more standardless, unreviewable discretion. And that, unfortunately, would only serve to exacerbate the problem. Illegal immigration is an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem in my home state of Texas, where I've spent real time down on the border visiting with ranchers, with farmers, with people living on the border who every week have people coming illegally across their property who no longer lock their doors at home because they've discovered if they lock their doors, they just get broken into. And so it's simpler not to lock the door rather than deal with the damage of the locks being broken or the doors kicked in. If you look at the numbers, in fiscal year 2012, the Border Patrol reported 463 deaths, 549 assaults, and 1,312 rescues. And let me point out, this current system is the opposite of humane. This current system ends up having vulnerable people coming here seeking freedom, entrusting themselves to coyotes, to drug cartels, to traffickers, and being left sometimes, women and children, to die in the desert, being left sometimes subject to sexual assault, to exploitation, to trafficking. The U.S. Department of State estimates that 14,000 to 17,000 people are trafficked into the United States every single year. And when it comes to the drug cartels and their role in facilitating illegal immigration, the volume is staggering. Between 2006 and 2013, there were 9.28 million pounds of marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin seized in Texas alone. To put that in perspective, the space shuttle weighs about 4.5 million pounds, which means there were twice as much, 2 space shuttles worth of illegal drugs seized, trafficked across the border. But, you know, the second major failing of this bill, it's not likely to pass. There are not 218 votes in the House of Representatives to pass a pathway to citizenship. My friends on the Democratic side of the aisle know that, but I think they've made a political judgment that they want to campaign on this issue rather than rolling up their sleeves and saying, how do we actually get a bill that can pass into law? That's what I hope this body does. Now, in the course of the markup, I worked very hard to try to improve this bill because I want to see a bill that fixes the problem pass into law. And specifically, I introduced 5 amendments to fix the bill, to fix the problem. Those amendments were all voted down with every Democrat on the committee voting against them. And on the floor of the Senate, I hope to introduce the same amendments. And if they're voted down again and this body passes that bill, I very much hope the House of Representatives will look to these amendments as providing a pathway to fixing this bill, to actually addressing the problem. The first bill I introduced was an amendment to actually secure the borders. The amendment I introduced, unlike the current bill, which requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to prepare a plan, and the trigger is when the Secretary prepares a plan, that triggers the legalization provisions of this bill. Well, a plan to plan is by design toothless. Instead, the amendment I introduced would have tripled the size of the U.S. Border Patrol to put manpower on the ground, boots on the ground, to solve the problem. It would have increased fourfold the helicopters and fixed-wing assets and technology on the ground to solve the problem. It would have put in place a biometric exit-entry system, because 40% of the illegal immigration we have comes from visa overstays. Unfortunately, every single Democrat on the committee voted against that amendment. Mr. President, I introduced two amendments to improve and substantially increase legal immigration. And on this point, let me pause for a second to note, there is no more enthusiastic advocate of legal immigration in the United States Senate than I am. I am the son of an immigrant. I am the son of one who had been imprisoned and tortured in Cuba, who came to this country with nothing, seeking freedom, and we need to welcome and celebrate legal immigrants. So I introduced two amendments focusing on improving legal immigration so that we can continue to welcome those from all around the world coming here seeking freedom. First, I introduced an amendment concerning temporary high-skilled worker, H-1B visas. Now, H-1B visas, high-skilled workers, are overwhelmingly pro-growth. The economic data indicates that for every 100 H-1B high-skilled workers who come into this country, 183 jobs are created for U.S. citizens. The amendment I introduced would take the current cap of H-1B visas, which is at 65,000, and increase it five-fold to 325,000. The current bill, the Gang of Eight bill, goes up to 110,000. That's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. There's far more demand than that. You know, right now, every year, we educate tens of thousands of foreign students in our universities. They get graduate degrees in mathematics and engineering and computer science. They get PhDs, and then we send them back to their countries, where they start businesses there, they create businesses there, they create jobs there, and they compete against us. It makes absolutely no sense. I think we need to expand dramatically high-skilled workers, and my amendment would increase it fivefold. Every single Democrat on the committee voted against it. Now, I would note, Mr. President, that the proponents of this bill often find themselves in Silicon Valley, telling our friends in the high-tech industry how they are champions for helping get more programmers, engineers, computer scientists into this country. And yet I'd note again, every single Democrat on the Judiciary Committee voted against increasing H-1B high-skilled workers. We need to increase that cap. The second amendment that I introduced that would increase legal immigration would double the overall cap on legal immigration from 675,000, the current statutory cap, to 1.35 million, so that we can have a legal system that has employment-based immigration. When people have jobs, they can meet areas of need, whether in agriculture or elsewhere, and they can also come for family unification. I'm sorry to say that many of my friends on the left side of the aisle, who often describe themselves as advocates of the Hispanic community, advocates of immigrants, every Democrat on the Judiciary Committee voted in party line against increasing legal immigration and against doubling the caps of legal immigration. Finally, I introduced two other amendments that were both directed to respecting and maintaining the rule of law. One amendment simply eliminated the pathway to citizenship, and what it provided is that those who are here illegally shall not be eligible for citizenship. Now, it's important to note, Mr. President, that under the existing bill, if my amendment had been adopted, those who are here illegally would be eligible for what's called RPI status, a legal status, and indeed in time would be eligible for legal permanent residency. So the underlying bill gives legal status to the 11 million people who are here illegally. The amendment I introduced simply said there needs to be a consequence for having violated the law. It is unfair, in my opinion, to the millions of legal immigrants who followed the rules, who stayed in line, who stayed in their home country years or decades, to reward those who broke the law with a path to citizenship. It is also, I believe, critical to passing this bill to remove the path to citizenship, and yet every single Democrat on the committee voted party line against this amendment. The final amendment I introduced was an amendment that provided that those who are here illegally shall not be eligible for state, local, or federal means-tested welfare payments. Now, this is an interesting issue because the advocates of the Gang of Eight bill frequently go on television and tell the American people none of those granted amnesty in their bill will be given welfare. I've seen that. That is a central talking point. Mr. President, if that talking point were true, this should have been a very easy amendment to adopt. But yet every single Democrat on the committee voted against this amendment. And one of the reasons is, although the Gang of Eight bill for a period exempts those here illegally from federal welfare, roughly $300 billion a year is spent in state welfare. And those who would give an amnesty under this bill would be eligible for a great portion of that state welfare, immediately means-tested welfare. In my view, we should welcome people from across the world, but the people we should be welcoming are those who are coming here to seek the American dream, to work hard. I believe that's the vast majority of immigrants who are coming here for a better life. And we should not be putting into place systems where the hardworking American taxpayers are being taxed to provide welfare for those who are here illegally. I think that respects the rule of law to say we will welcome you here if you are working to provide for your family. You know, each of these amendments were rejected, and often my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle would say something like, I may agree with this particular amendment, but there was a deal cut. I may agree, but the union bosses, the special interests, the people in the closed-door rooms who negotiated this deal, we agreed on a level and we can't increase it. It may be good to increase high-skilled workers up to $325,000, but we cut a deal with the union bosses and we can't change it. Mr. President, that's not how legislation should be drafted. We should be fixing the problem. We should be making our economy stronger. Right now, in my opinion, this bill is headed to failure. There should be no drama. There should be no confusion. Now, let's be clear. This bill, I am convinced, is going to pass the U.S. Senate. In fact, I think it's going to pass the U.S. Senate with a substantial margin. In all likelihood, near the end of this process, there will be an amendment or two directed at border security that the American people will be told, okay, this finally puts teeth into the border security provisions. I hope those representations prove true. But regardless of what happens on that, I believe the votes are already pre-cooked that this bill is going to pass the U.S. Senate. But absent major revisions, absent revisions along the lines of the amendments that I introduced in committee and intend to introduce on the floor again, this bill will crash and burn in the House. And it is designed to do so. So how do we save it? If we actually want to fix the problem, not have a political game, but fix the problem, the answer, Mr. President, is the American people. The American people have to speak up. If you want to see the border secured, pick up the phone and let your elected representatives know. Let senators know. Let members of the House know. Speak out online. Speak out publicly. When the American people speak out and speak out loudly, their voices are heard. If you want legal immigration improved so that we welcome high-skilled workers, we welcome those seeking the American dream, speak out. If you want to respect the rule of law and not grant amnesty without securing the borders, speak out and speak out loud. And let me say, what needs to happen to change this dynamic is the key stakeholders need to decide that failure is not an option. The high-tech community, the business community, farmers and agricultural leaders need to decide that they are not willing to have this entire bill held hostage to a provision providing a pathway to citizenship that is certain to fail and designed to fail. And I want to speak finally to the Hispanic advocacy groups, to the many who passionately pour their hearts into trying to improve the conditions of those in this country, including the 11 million who are here illegally. I believe the current path this bill is on is a path that is, by design, going to yield it being voted down. I think that is why the Obama White House is insisting on a pathway to citizenship. I would note, in 2007, then-Senator Obama stood on this floor of this Senate and played a key role in killing immigration reform then for the same reasons, for partisan reasons. And indeed, I would suggest the moment of clarity came in the Judiciary Committee markup when a senior Democrat, who is one of the sponsors of this bill, said, if there is no path to citizenship, there can be no reform. I think that sentence summed it all up. And I certainly thank that senior Democrat for his candor, because he made clear that there was one overwhelming partisan objective, which is a path to citizenship. And in his judgment, if that partisan objective could not be accomplished 100%, he was willing to do nothing, zero, to improve the border. He was willing to do nothing, zero, to improve legal immigration, nothing, zero, to expand high-tech immigration, nothing, zero, to improve farmers and agricultural workers, and most tellingly, nothing, zero, to improve the condition of the 11 million people currently here illegally. Because, based on the Obama White House's position that with no path to citizenship, we will take our marbles and go home, we will crater this entire bill. That outcome means those 11 million remain in the shadows, have no legal status, whereas if the proponents of this bill actually demonstrate a commitment not to politics, not to campaigning all the time, but to actually fixing this problem, to finding a middle ground, that would fix the problem and also allow for those 11 million people who are here illegally a legal status with citizenship off the table. I believe that's the compromise that can pass, but at least right now, the partisan advocates of this bill are not willing to accept that. The only thing that can change that is if the American people speak up. The only thing that can change that is if the stakeholders make clear to the Obama White House, to the Senate Democrats, failure is not an option, that if this fails because as a political matter you insisted on a path to citizenship and threw everything else overboard, that failure would be unacceptable. I very much hope we work together in a bipartisan manner to fix this problem in a way that secures the border, in a way that respects rule of law, and in a way that improves legal immigration so we remain a nation that welcomes and celebrates legal immigrants. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, before I begin my remarks, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Molly Groom, a detailee to the Foreign Relations Committee from the Department of Homeland Security, be given floor privileges for the duration of debate S-744.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I had a more robust statement that I intend to make later, but since I understand the time is truncated, I will wait for that because I'm not going to equivocate on something that I feel passionately about and something that I have worked a long time as part of the Gang of Eight to achieve. So hopefully I'll get to that later today. But I did want to take the opportunity of the time that is available to just create a certain context, having just heard from my colleague from Texas. I'm glad that he acknowledges this bill will pass the Senate. I believe the bill will pass the Senate because the American people are tired of a broken immigration system that neither meets our values, preserves our security, or promotes our economy. And that's what is driving the American people in poll after poll to say it's time to fix our broken system. Now, I've heard the comments about this bill will pass the Senate, but it won't pass the House. Well, having served in the House, I'm not quite sure anybody can make that determination. Part of it will be what leadership wants to achieve in the House or what it does not seek to achieve. And I would not negotiate against myself, against a process in the House which I am unaware of at this moment exactly how they're going to pursue it. So why would I seek to diminish the Senate's prerogative to send what they think is the appropriate reform on immigration to the House for their consideration? I wouldn't want to do that. That's what conferences are all about. So if the House has a different view as to how do we reform our broken immigration system, has a different view as to how we ensure the national security of the United States, has a different view as to how we promote the economic interests that immigration reform does promote, has a different view as to how do we ensure that workers' wages are not suppressed by having an underclass of millions of people who are exploited and therefore bring down the wages of all other American workers, fine. Let them express their view, and then we come together in a conference to negotiate what hopefully can be a final version to be sent to the President. Now, I find it ironic that my colleague from Texas consistently refers to Senate Democrats insisting on a pathway to citizenship. I assume that he takes the mantle of the Republican Party and says that all Republicans believe that there should be no pathway to citizenship. And that obviously is rejected by the 4 colleagues that worked with me for months, Senator McCain, Senator Graham, Senator Flake, Senator Rubio, that believe that a pathway to citizenship is an important ingredient towards achieving the comprehensive reform we all want, as well as others who have expressed support for that concept. Now, I know that it may be popular with some of my colleagues to invoke President Obama's name as some type of red herring in this process. The bottom line is that the bill that we are debating, I hope we will be debating after the motion to proceed shortly, is about finding the fixes to our broken immigration system that was devised by 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and has since been supported by more. So it isn't about President Obama. It's about getting the Senate to function and to solve one of the critical issues facing this country. Now, I heard the suggestion that only Senate Democrats got amendments that they wanted and opposed amendments of Republicans in the Judiciary Committee. My understanding is that there were 136 amendments adopted in the Judiciary Committee, of which all but 3 were bipartisan amendments, all Republican-sponsored amendments. So I respect that the gentleman had amendments, and maybe his view did not prevail, but it isn't that there wasn't a bipartisan process that led to 136 amendments to the original proposition that the Gang of 8 put forward in order to be able to move forward. As a matter of fact, I think some of those who have opposed and still oppose comprehensive immigration reform, I know that there are some, if 10 angels came swearing from above that this would be the right policy for America, they would say, no, you're wrong, to the 10 angels. I get it. I understand where they're at. But the process held in the Judiciary Committee was as about open and transparent and as fair as you can have. And that's why there are 136 changes to our proposal by virtue of the Judiciary Committee. And finally, this reference to union bosses. I don't know any union bosses that were in any room. As a matter of fact, part of the compromise here is that labor didn't get everything it wanted, neither did the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But they both agreed, and they were standing behind us when we announced this legislation and saying this is good for America. And so big business and the AFL-CIO, the United Farm Workers with the big agro-growers in this country, the most progressive pro-immigrant groups with Grover Norcross and the Club for Growth, all saying that this legislation was what is important and necessary for America. So everybody is entitled to their opinion, Mr. President, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And I expect during the course of this debate to make sure that at least when we are debating the same facts. This legislation is good for our country. It will reform our broken immigration system. It will let me know who is here to pursue the American dream versus who might be here to do it harm. It will create economic opportunity for all Americans. It will add more taxpayers to the rolls of this country so that there can be true shared burden at the end of the day, and it will create greater enterprise as is exhibited by the high-tech companies of which so many have been created by immigrants in this country. I look forward to a fuller opportunity to present all of the reasons why this legislation, including tough border security provisions more than ever before, more money spent than ever before, and in fact spent in an intelligent way, and in fact in a way that ultimately, cumulatively, creates for border security more money than we are spending in domestic law enforcement as a whole. So, Mr. President, I look forward to that opportunity, and until then, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I arise to talk about 4 claims that this bill makes, these 4 claims that are on the chart, to disprove those claims under certain circumstances. But before I do that, everybody that's spoken so far has said we have to pass a bill. I don't disagree with that. But not just any bill. A bill that secures the border is very necessary. The status quo is not justifiable. We have to realize the reality of the fact that you can't gather up 11 or 12 million people to deport, and if you did that, you'd hurt the economy. Now, that's the reality of it. Now, to get around that, we've got to get a bill that gets through the Senate, the House of Representatives, and that the President approves. So my main goal throughout these next 2 or 3 weeks is to develop a bill that accomplishes that, but to stress that a lot of things that have been said by the authors of this legislation are not accurate. So I will take a few minutes to discuss how the authors have tried to sell the immigration bill and what I see as false advertising. Legislators are in the business of selling ideas. With this bill, the American people are being sold a product. They're being asked to accept legalization, and in exchange, they'd be assured through this legislation that the laws are going to be enforced. Normally, consumers are able to read the labels of things that they're about to purchase. They'd have to read about 1,175 pages of this bill to really know what it truly says. But even a quick read of the bill would leave many shaking their heads in confusion. You've heard the phrase, the devil's in the details. At first, the proposal that the bipartisan group put forward sounded very reasonable. But we need to examine the fine print and take a closer look at what the bill does. As I noted yesterday, I thought the framework, that's when they started working on it, held hope. But I realized that the assurances the group of 8 made didn't really translate when the bill language emerged. They professed that the border would be secured and that people would earn their legal status. However, the bill as drafted is legalization first, enforcement later, if at all. So I'd like to dive into the details and give a little reality check to those who expect this bill to do exactly as the authors promised. So what do the proponents of this bill say the legislation will do? Well, the first thing on my chart, people will have to pay a penalty to obtain legal status. The bill lays out the application procedure, and on page 972, a penalty is imposed on those who apply for registered provisional immigration status. It says that those who apply must pay $1,000 to the Department of Homeland Security. It waives the penalty for anyone under 21 years. Yet, on the next page, it allows the applicant to pay the penalty in installments. The bill says, quote, "The Secretary shall establish a process for collecting payments that permit the penalty to be paid in periodic installments that shall be completed before the alien may be granted an extension of status." In effect, this says that the applicant has 6 years to pay the $1,000. That's how long it takes to get RPI status. In addition to the penalty, applicants would pay a processing fee, a level set by the Secretary. The bill says that the Secretary has a discretion to waive the processing fee for any classes of individuals that she chooses and may limit maximum fee paid by a family. So, the fact is the bill doesn't actually require everyone to pay a penalty. In view of the waiver, it doesn't require anyone to pay it when they apply for legal status. In fact, they may never have to pay a penalty. So let's go to number 2 on the chart. People will have to pay back taxes to receive legal status. The reality. Members of the Group of 8 stated over and over again that their bill would require undocumented individuals to pay back taxes prior to being granted legal status. However, the bill before us fails to make good on that promise. Proponents of the bill point to a provision in the bill that prohibits people from filing for legal status, quote, "unless the applicant has satisfied any applicable federal tax liability," end of quote. Now, sounds good, right? But as always, the devil's in the details. There are 2 important weaknesses with how the bill defines, quote unquote, applicable federal tax liability. First, the bill limits the definition to exclude employer taxes, Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes. So think of that exclusion. Second, the bill does not require the payment of all back taxes legally owed. What it requires is a payment of taxes assessed by the Internal Revenue Service. Now think of the IRS assessing. In order to assess a tax, the IRS first must have information on which to base this assessment. Our tax system is largely a voluntary system on self-reporting, but it also relies on certain third-party reporting, such as wages reported by the employer. That is a W-2 form. If someone has been working unlawfully in the country and working off the books, it is likely that neither an individual return or a third-party return will exist. Thus, no assessment will exist and no taxes will be paid. Similarly, it is very unlikely that an assessment will exist for those who have worked under false Social Security numbers and never paid tax. A legal obligation exists to pay taxes on all income from whatever source is derived. Nothing in this bill provides a requirement or a mechanism to accomplish this prior to granting legal status. One of the gang members in January said this, quote, "Shouldn't citizens pay back taxes? Question mark. We can trace their employment back. It doesn't take a genius," end of quote. While it may seem common sense, the other side of the aisle is going to argue that establishing the requirement to pay back taxes owed rather than assessed is unworkable and costly. They will also claim that imposing additional tax barriers on this population could prevent undocumented workers and their families from coming forward. But the sales pitch has been clear. To get legal status, one has to pay back taxes. Let me provide a reality check. The bill doesn't make good on the promises made. Third, they say that people will have to learn English. The reality. The bill as drafted is supposed to ensure that new Americans speak a common language. Learning English is a way new residents assimilate. This is an issue that is very important. Immigrants before us made a concerted effort to learn English. The proponents are claiming the bill fulfills this wish. However, the bill does not require people here unlawfully to learn English before receiving legal status or even a green card. Under Section 2101, a person with RPI status who applies for a green card only has to pursue courses and study to achieve an understanding of English and knowledge and understanding of civics. If the people who gain legal access ever apply for citizenship, and some doubt that this will happen to a majority of the undocumented population, they would have to pass an English proficiency exam as required under current law. So yes, after 13 years, one would have to pass an exam. But the bill does very little to ensure that those who come out of the shadows will cherish or use the English language. The reality is that English isn't as much of a priority for the proponents as the bill as much as they claim it is. Fourth and last, they say people won't get public benefits when they choose to apply for legal status. The reality, Americans are very compassionate and generous. Many people can understand providing some legal status to people here illegally. But one major sticking point for those who question a legalization program is the fact that lawbreakers could become eligible for public benefits and taxpayer subsidies. The authors of the bill understood this, thank God. In an attempt to show that those who receive RPI status would not receive taxpayers' benefits, they included a provision that prohibited the population from receiving certain benefits. There are two major problems with the bill on this point. First, those who receive RPI status will be immediately eligible for state and local welfare benefits. For instance, many states offer cash, medical, and food assistance through state-only programs to lawfully present citizens. Second, the bill contains a welfare waiver loophole that could allow those with RPI status to receive federal welfare dollars. The Obama administration has pushed the envelope by waiving welfare laws. If this loophole isn't closed, they could waive existing laws and allow funds provided under the welfare block grant, known as temporary assistance to needy families, to be provided to non-citizens. Now, Senator Hatch had an amendment during committee markup that would prohibit U.S. Department of HHS from waiving various requirements of TANF program. His amendment would also prohibit any federal agency from waiving restrictions on eligibility of immigrants for public benefits. But the reality check for the American people is that there are loopholes and the potential for public benefits to go to those who are legalized under the bill. Again, the devil is in the details, and I hope this reality check will encourage proponents of the bill to fix these problems before the bill is passed in the Senate. The American people, then, deserve truth in advertising. We can't maintain the status quo on immigration. Bills say it will do. And so I've tried to point out to you some of the promises that may not be kept. Authorize waivers in this bill, and I use that word a few times, delegate to the Secretary to actually take action contrary to what is claimed by the authors, and hence can undercut the intentions of the authors. We should legislate then and not delegate. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on adoption of the motion to proceed to S-744. We have the yeas and nays. Yeas and nays. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Yeah. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reid of Rhode Island. Mr. Reid of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Durbin, Grassley, Leahy, Pryor, Schumer, and Udall of New Mexico. Senators voting in the negative: Lee and Sessions. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Chiesa, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Warner. Mr. Warner. Aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Shee. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen. Aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. Aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester. Aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Johans, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? Aye. Ms. Heitkamp? Aye. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Cowan? Mr. Cowan? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Kirk? Mr. Kirk? No. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? No. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Ms. Ayotte? Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? No. Mrs. Hagan? Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? Aye. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Hatch? Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Begich? Mr. Begich? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Enzi? Mr. Enzi? No. Mr. Barrasso? Mr. Barrasso? No. Ms. Landrieu? Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts? No. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller. Aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye.